Have you ever noticed how some of the most compassionate people suddenly become distant, quiet, or even misunderstood? People often say, "You've changed." But what they rarely realize is that the change didn't come from arrogance, coldness, or pride. It came from awakening. An empath experiences the world differently from most people. Long before they understand it, they feel everything: the joy of a room, the tension between two strangers, the sadness hidden behind a smile. Their nervous system becomes an antenna for human emotion. For years, this sensitivity shapes how they live. They become the listener, the helper, the emotional caretaker. For most empaths, the early years of life quietly shape an identity that feels natural but is rarely questioned. From a young age, they sense the emotional atmosphere around them with unusual intensity. They notice tension before anyone speaks. They feel sadness even when people try to hide it. Without realizing it, they begin adapting themselves to the emotional needs of others. This adaptation slowly becomes their personality. They become the one who understands everyone, the one who keeps the peace, the one who senses what others need before it is even expressed. Over time, their identity becomes intertwined with this role. Being empathetic is no longer just a trait, it becomes the foundation of how they define themselves. Because of this sensitivity, many empaths learn early that their value lies in how much emotional comfort they can provide to others. They listen when no one else does. They forgive quickly. They absorb tension in a room and try to smooth it over. In relationships, they often become the emotional stabilizer, the one who carries the invisible weight of everyone else's feelings. For a long time, this feels like purpose. Helping others brings them meaning. Being needed gives them a sense of belonging. When someone feels better because of their presence, it reinforces the idea that their role in life is to give emotionally without limits. But beneath this pattern lies something more complex. Most empaths never stop to ask a simple but profound question. Who am I when I am not managing someone else's emotions? The moment of awakening begins when this question suddenly becomes unavoidable. Often it does not appear during peaceful moments. Instead, it emerges during periods of exhaustion, emotional betrayal, or overwhelming confusion. The empath begins noticing that the role they have been playing for years is slowly draining them. They feel responsible for people who never feel responsible for them. They offer endless understanding to those who rarely return it. The realization arrives slowly but powerfully. The identity they built was not entirely chosen. It was formed as a response to emotional environments they learned to navigate. This realization shakes the very foundation of how they see themselves. If their identity has always been built around helping, understanding, and absorbing the emotions of others, what happens when they stop doing that? The mind resists this question at first because the old identity feels safe. It provides a clear role in the world. Without it, the empath feels uncertain, even guilty. They begin to worry that stepping back from others' emotional demands might make them selfish, distant, or uncaring. But awakening brings a deeper awareness that challenges these fears. They begin noticing how often they ignored their own needs just to maintain harmony. They recall moments where they stayed silent to avoid conflict, even when something felt wrong. They see how many times they tolerated behavior that quietly hurt them because they believed understanding others mattered more than protecting themselves. These realizations create an internal tension. Part of the empath still clings to the familiar identity of the emotional caretaker. Another part begins questioning whether that identity has been limiting their growth all along. As this tension grows, the old identity starts to crack. The empath begins pulling back from situations that once felt normal, conversations that revolve around constant emotional drama start feeling heavy rather than meaningful. Relationships that depend entirely on their patience and forgiveness begin to reveal an imbalance they can no longer ignore. At first, this shift feels uncomfortable. The empath may feel lost because the role they once played gave them direction. Without constantly managing the emotional landscape of others, they must now face their own inner world. This inner confrontation is one of the most difficult parts of awakening. For years, their attention was focused outward. Now it turns inward, revealing emotions, desires, and questions they had previously pushed aside. The collapse of the old identity is not a sudden explosion, but a gradual dismantling of patterns that once defined them. Each realization removes another layer of the personality they built around pleasing, understanding, and supporting others. Slowly, the empath begins to recognize that their sensitivity was never meant to trap them in emotional servitude. It was meant to become awareness. What once looked like kindness begins revealing hidden self-neglect. What once felt like emotional strength begins exposing how often they carried burdens that were never theirs. As the old identity dissolves, the empath starts seeing themselves beyond the role they have played for most of their life. They begin understanding that empathy does not require constant self-sacrifice, and compassion does not mean losing their individuality. And in the quiet space left behind by the collapsing identity, a deeper and more authentic sense of self begins to emerge, unfamiliar but undeniably real, forcing the empath to confront who they truly are beyond the expectations they once lived to fulfill for most of their lives. Empaths move through the world guided by feeling rather than analysis. They sense emotional currents instinctively, often responding to the pain or needs of others before those feelings are even spoken. Because of this, they naturally assume that people are generally sincere in the emotions they express. If someone appears hurt, the empath feels compassion. If someone appears angry, the empath tries to understand the pain behind it. This emotional openness is part of their nature, but it also makes them vulnerable to something they rarely recognize in the beginning. The hidden emotional layers within people that are not always honest, conscious, or pure. During a spiritual awakening, one of the most profound shifts an empath experiences is the growing awareness of what can be called the emotional shadow. The emotional shadow represents the feelings, impulses, and motivations people hide from themselves and from others. These hidden aspects often include jealousy, resentment, insecurity, pride, and unacknowledged anger. Most individuals prefer to believe they are acting with good intentions, so these darker emotions are pushed out of awareness. Yet they continue to influence behavior in subtle and powerful ways. Before awakening, an empath often interprets people's actions through the lens of compassion alone. They assume that hurtful behavior comes only from visible suffering. When someone acts harshly, the empath instinctively looks for the wound behind the behavior and tries to soothe it. This instinct can be beautiful, but it also blinds the empath to a deeper truth. Not every emotional expression is simply pain seeking healing. Sometimes it is fear protecting itself. Sometimes it is pride refusing to admit weakness. Sometimes it is insecurity trying to dominate others in order to feel powerful. The awakening process begins when the empath starts noticing these hidden dynamics. They begin observing patterns in how people behave. A friend who constantly criticizes others may actually be hiding deep insecurity. A person who always plays the victim may be avoiding responsibility for their own actions. Someone who appears charming and supportive may secretly feel threatened by the success or independence of others. These realizations can feel shocking at first. For an empath who has always believed in the sincerity of emotional expression, recognizing these shadow dynamics can feel like discovering a hidden dimension of human psychology. It becomes clear that many interactions are not just exchanges of emotion, but subtle psychological negotiations. People project feelings they cannot face within themselves. An angry person may accuse others of hostility. A jealous person may disguise their envy as moral criticism. A controlling person may claim they are simply trying to help. The empath begins seeing how these emotional projections quietly shape relationships. Before awakening, they often absorbed these projections without realizing it. If someone blamed them, they searched for what they had done wrong. If someone expressed disappointment, they tried to fix the situation. If someone became distant or critical, they assumed responsibility for restoring harmony. But awareness of the emotional shadow changes this pattern. The empath begins noticing that not every accusation is truth, and not every emotional reaction belongs to them. Sometimes people are reacting to their own inner conflicts rather than anything the empath has actually done. This realization is both liberating and unsettling. It frees the empath from unnecessary guilt, but it also removes the illusion that relationships are always as transparent as they appear. The emotional world becomes more complex, layered with unconscious motives and hidden fears. As this awareness deepens, the empath also begins recognizing their own shadow. They start seeing how their need to help others sometimes came from a desire to feel valued. They notice how avoiding conflict allowed unhealthy dynamics to continue. They realize that constantly rescuing people prevented those individuals from facing their own growth. This self-awareness is not about self-criticism, but about clarity. By acknowledging their own emotional patterns, the empath gains a deeper understanding of human nature. Compassion becomes more balanced because it is no longer blind. Instead of immediately absorbing the emotions around them, they pause and observe. They ask themselves whether what they are feeling truly belongs to them. They notice when someone is projecting frustration or insecurity. They recognize when emotional manipulation is disguised as vulnerability. They begin separating genuine pain from unconscious patterns that repeat again and again in certain individuals. Through this awareness, empathy evolves into something more refined. It is no longer just the ability to feel what others feel. It becomes the ability to see the full psychological landscape behind those emotions, the visible feelings as well as the hidden ones that influence behavior from the shadows. And as the empath becomes more conscious of these shadow dynamics, they begin navigating relationships with a new level of perception, noticing subtle shifts in tone, contradictions between words and emotions, and the quiet ways people reveal parts of themselves they do not yet fully understand, revealing that human interaction is often shaped less by what people openly express and more by the deeper forces moving beneath the surface of their awareness. For most empaths, the idea of boundaries does not come naturally at first. Their instinct is to remain open, available, and emotionally responsive to the needs of others. From an early age, they learn to read feelings in the room and respond with understanding. If someone is upset, they listen. If someone is struggling, they help. If conflict appears, they try to calm it. Over time, this emotional openness becomes a habit that shapes how they move through the world. They answer messages even when they are exhausted. They listen to problems even when their mind is overwhelmed. They give second chances, third chances, and sometimes endless chances because they believe compassion means being endlessly patient. At first glance, this behavior looks like kindness. But as an empath moves deeper into spiritual awakening, they begin realizing something important about the nature of compassion. Without boundaries, compassion slowly turns into emotional depletion. Every conversation, every request for support, and every emotional expectation begins to take a piece of their energy. Because they feel things so deeply, the emotional weight they carry from others can accumulate in ways most people never notice. An empath may spend hours thinking about someone else's problem long after the conversation has ended. They replay situations in their mind, wondering if they said the right thing or if they could have helped more. They carry emotional residue from interactions that others forget within minutes. Over time, this constant emotional processing creates exhaustion. It is not physical tiredness alone, but a deeper kind of fatigue that affects the mind and spirit. The empath begins to feel overwhelmed by social demands that once felt natural. They start needing silence more often. Crowded emotional environments feel draining rather than energizing. This is usually the moment when the first awareness of boundaries begins to emerge. At first, the idea feels uncomfortable. The empath may worry that creating distance will make them seem cold or uncaring. They may feel guilty when they decline a request for help or when they choose solitude instead of conversation. But awakening slowly reveals a deeper truth. Compassion without limits does not create harmony, it creates imbalance. When an empath gives endlessly while others only receive, the relationship quietly becomes one-sided. The empath becomes the emotional container for everyone else's feelings, while their own needs remain unspoken and often ignored. Recognizing this imbalance is the beginning of transformation. The empath starts noticing how certain interactions leave them feeling drained, while others feel nourishing. They observe how some individuals consistently rely on them for emotional stability without offering the same presence in return. This awareness leads to a powerful shift in perspective. Instead of measuring kindness by how much they give, the empath begins measuring it by whether the exchange of energy feels healthy and mutual. They start understanding that boundaries are not barriers against compassion, but structures that protect it. A boundary allows empathy to exist without turning into sacrifice. When an empath begins setting these boundaries, their behavior naturally changes. They respond to messages when they have the emotional space rather than immediately out of obligation. They listen to others with presence, but no longer feel responsible for solving every problem. They step away from conversations that revolve endlessly around negativity or drama. To someone who was used to the empath's unlimited availability, this shift can feel surprising. People may say the empath has changed or become distant. Some may even accuse them of becoming selfish. But the empath understands something they did not understand before. True compassion includes self-respect. Protecting their energy does not reduce their kindness. In fact, it strengthens it. When their emotional space is no longer overwhelmed, the empathy they offer becomes clearer and more sincere. Instead of reacting automatically to every emotional signal around them, they choose when and how to engage. Boundaries also create a new level of honesty in relationships. People begin to reveal who they truly are when unlimited emotional access is no longer available. Some relationships deepen because they become more balanced and respectful. Others quietly fade away because they were sustained only by the empath's endless tolerance. Although this shift can feel uncomfortable at times, it also brings a profound sense of peace. The empath no longer feels responsible for maintaining every emotional connection. They allow others to carry their own experiences rather than absorbing them entirely. Through this process, the empath begins realizing that their sensitivity has never meant to make them endlessly available to the emotional demands of the world. Instead, it was meant to guide them toward deeper awareness. Where compassion flows with intention, relationships develop with mutual respect, and the energy they once gave away without limit becomes something they guard carefully, recognizing that the ability to feel deeply is not a burden to surrender, but a gift that must be protected with quiet discipline and conscious choice. For much of their lives, empaths experience the world through emotional absorption. Feelings around them do not simply pass by, they enter deeply into their awareness. A tense room feels heavy in their chest. Someone else's sadness quietly becomes their own. Even unspoken emotions seem to echo inside their mind as if they were personally responsible for them. At first, this ability feels like a natural extension of empathy. It allows the empath to connect with others on a profound level. People often feel understood in their presence because the empath senses what lies beneath words. Conversations feel deeper, more authentic, and emotionally rich. Yet this same sensitivity carries a hidden difficulty. When emotional absorption becomes constant, the empath loses the ability to separate their own inner state from the emotional atmosphere around them. The boundary between self and others becomes blurred. They may wake up feeling peaceful, but suddenly feel anxious after entering a room filled with tension. They may spend time with someone who is quietly resentful and later feel emotionally unsettled without understanding why. For many empaths, this confusion becomes a normal part of life. They assume that these shifting emotions belong to them. When they feel overwhelmed, they search their own mind for explanations. They wonder if they are too sensitive or emotionally unstable, unaware that much of what they feel is simply being absorbed from the environment around them. Spiritual awakening begins changing this pattern. One of the first realizations that emerges is the understanding that feeling everything does not necessarily mean understanding everything. Emotional sensitivity alone does not guarantee clarity. Without awareness, it can lead to emotional overload rather than insight. The empath begins noticing how easily they internalize the emotional states of others. A friend's frustration becomes their stress. A stranger's sadness lingers in their thoughts long after the encounter has ended. They start seeing how their nervous system has been constantly reacting to signals that were never meant for them to carry. This realization introduces a new possibility. Instead of absorbing emotions automatically, the empath begins observing them. Observation creates distance, not emotional coldness, but clarity. When an emotion appears in a conversation or environment, the empath pauses internally. They ask themselves a simple but powerful question: is this feeling truly mine? This small moment of awareness begins transforming their relationship with emotion. Instead of merging with every feeling they encounter, they start witnessing emotions as information. Anger becomes a signal that someone may feel threatened or unheard. Sadness becomes a sign of loss or unmet needs. Anxiety may reveal hidden fears beneath the surface of a situation. Through observation, emotions become messages rather than burdens. The empath gradually learns to interpret emotional patterns instead of drowning in them. They notice how certain people carry consistent emotional states that influence their behavior. They recognize when tension in a group is spreading through subtle reactions and unspoken expectations. This shift from absorption to observation turns sensitivity into perception. The empath no longer feels obligated to carry the emotional weight they detect. Instead, they develop the ability to understand emotional dynamics without losing their own center. For example, when someone expresses anger, the empath may still sense the intensity of that emotion, but they no longer internalize it as a personal responsibility. They see the emotion as something belonging to the other person's inner world. This change is deeply empowering. Emotional wisdom begins forming as the empath learns that feelings are signals, not commands. They do not have to react to every emotional impulse they sense. They can choose how to respond with calm awareness rather than automatic emotional participation. As this awareness deepens, the empath's presence also changes. Instead of becoming overwhelmed in emotionally charged situations, they become grounded observers. Their calmness often stabilizes the environment because they are no longer amplifying the emotions around them through unconscious absorption. People may still feel understood in their presence, but the connection now comes from clarity rather than shared emotional chaos. The empath listens carefully, senses emotional nuance, and responds thoughtfully rather than reactively. They begin recognizing that emotional intelligence is not about feeling everything intensely, but about understanding the meaning and movement of emotions within human interaction. Through this transformation, sensitivity becomes a source of quiet strength rather than constant vulnerability. The empath discovers that emotional awareness does not require losing themselves inside the emotional worlds of others. It allows them to remain present, perceptive, and deeply compassionate while standing firmly within their own inner balance, where emotions can be felt, understood, and respected without allowing them to take control of their thoughts, their identity, or the steady awareness that now guides how they move through every interaction they encounter. For many empaths, life before awakening revolves around adaptation. They learn to adjust themselves to the emotional needs, expectations, and personalities of the people around them. Because they sense feelings so easily, they often shape their behavior in ways that maintain harmony and prevent conflict. Over time, this ability to adapt becomes second nature. They become agreeable when others are upset. They stay silent when disagreement might create tension. They offer support even when they are exhausted. Slowly, without fully realizing it, they begin living according to the emotional atmosphere around them, rather than according to their own inner direction. This pattern creates a quiet distance between who they truly are and the role they play in the world. On the surface, the empath appears kind, understanding, and reliable. But beneath that image, their authentic voice often remains hidden. Their real opinions, desires, and boundaries are softened or suppressed in order to keep peace with others. Spiritual awakening begins disrupting this pattern in profound ways. As awareness grows, the empath starts noticing how often they have ignored their own truth in order to maintain relationships. They remember moments where they agreed with things that felt wrong internally. They recall times when they stayed in environments that drained them simply because leaving might disappoint someone. These realizations create an inner tension that can no longer be ignored. The empath begins questioning the identity they have been living through for most of their life. They ask themselves whether the version of them that others know is truly their authentic self or simply a reflection of what others needed them to be. This question marks the beginning of transformation. Authentic selfhood does not emerge instantly. It develops through a gradual process of self-discovery. The empath begins listening more carefully to their own thoughts and emotional responses. Instead of automatically adjusting to others, they pause and ask what they genuinely feel. At first, this can feel unfamiliar. For someone who has spent years prioritizing other people's emotional experiences, focusing on their own inner voice may even feel uncomfortable or selfish. Yet, as the process continues, something deeper begins to unfold. The empath starts recognizing personal values that had previously been overshadowed by their role as a caretaker. They realize that their perspective matters, their boundaries matter, their preferences and aspirations are not obstacles to compassion, but essential parts of their individuality. Gradually, their behavior begins reflecting this awareness. They speak more honestly when something feels misaligned. They step away from situations that contradict their inner sense of truth. They choose relationships that allow authenticity rather than constant emotional accommodation. This shift changes how others perceive them. Some people who were comfortable with the empath's old role may feel confused by this new sense of independence. The empath is no longer simply the emotional supporter who adapts to every situation. They are becoming someone who stands firmly within their own identity. While this transformation may create temporary friction in relationships, it also attracts a different kind of connection. People who value authenticity begin recognizing something genuine in the empath's presence. Conversations become more real because the empath is no longer filtering every thought through the need to maintain harmony. Authenticity also brings a new level of inner stability. When a person lives according to their true nature rather than external expectations, their decisions become clearer. They no longer feel the constant tension of trying to satisfy everyone around them. Instead, their actions align with their deeper sense of meaning. For the empath, this alignment is profoundly liberating. Their sensitivity, which once made them vulnerable to the emotional currents of others, now becomes a tool for self-awareness. They understand their feelings more clearly and recognize when something supports their growth or pulls them away from it. Instead of dissolving their identity into the emotional landscape of every relationship, they begin expressing a presence that is distinctly their own. They still care deeply about others. They still feel compassion and understanding. But these qualities now flow from a place of authenticity rather than obligation. The empath no longer measures their worth by how much they sacrifice or how well they manage the emotions of others. Their value becomes rooted in their willingness to live truthfully, even when that truth challenges expectations or disrupts familiar roles. Through this transformation, the empath discovers that individuality and compassion are not opposites but partners in the process of becoming whole. And as this authentic self continues to unfold, the empath moves through life with a quiet confidence that no longer depends on approval or emotional validation, guided instead by the steady awareness that their deepest purpose is not to disappear into the needs of others, but to embody the truth of who they are while remaining open enough to feel the world without losing themselves within it.